I'll break it down and rank the various objections by the amount of logical value I see in them, lowest to highest. Moral or religious objections. We're playing God! The reason I rank this the lowest is that we've been playing God for over 1,000 years. Other animals have too. Insects are the reason some plants make flowers. We eat the sweetest berries, we harvest the largest seeds. The plants with those genes get favored by a broader dispersal. We are an agent of selection, which plays into the process of evolution that began over 2.8 billion years ago. Today we are the weather, the ecology, and the fitness landscape. But that's just plants. The issue that makes people a bit more squeamish is modifying animals. The EnviroPig has been selected for its reduced phosphate excretion. This is both less smelly and better for the environment, although it raises questions about our role as stewards of our planet. We've been modifying wild animals by the same processes of selective breeding, so that we produce the Chihuahua from the wolf lineage. These selectively bred animals have health problems, of course, but a wolf won't guard sheep or help search for lost children or drug shipments. There's a difference between breeding a trait over 1,000 years and producing it in a year in a lab. But I want to react to specific evidence in actual cases, not hand-waving and fear-mongering. There may be some cases where genetic modification can save lives, improve living conditions, and minimize our environmental impact. There may also be cases that really are endangering our ecosystem. Safety of consumption. I can see why this is a very common objection to GMO. We have very little data what the effects of introducing foreign DNA and proteins into a food crop will be on our health. However, there's little evidence to suggest that GMO crops don't have the same level of nutrient content. A classic example is the flavor saver tomato. Scientists inactivated a gene product that degrades pectin in the tomato, allowing it to reach market without softening or rotting. It's a matter of turning off a product currently being made by the tomato rather than adding a new protein. Some describe the flavor as bad, but that may have more to do with the particular tomato that they chose to modify, rather than the genetic modification itself. More recent revisions are still being sold as premium hothouse tomatoes. Outcrossing, or contamination of wild strains. There is a risk that whatever modification we make to a crop will be transferred to another non-crop plant. There is some evidence that this is possible, but no confirmation that it has occurred in the wild, so to speak. 90% of the U.S. soybean crop and 70% of the corn crop contain the Roundup Ready transgene. We've seen the evolution of resistance in weeds, but it's not a match with the introduced transgene sequence. So it appears that overuse of Roundup, and not the GMO itself, is the bigger threat. I think you can make a reasonable case that this is an indirect cause, because farmers can be indiscriminate in their spraying. Environmental consequences. A possible consequence of high-yield GMO varieties is the same as a non-GMO high-yield variety, and that is soil depletion. The more that plants are able to take out of the soil, the more we have to put back in. It also means a more tempting food source for the insect or pathogen that can exploit it. That means water, fertilizer, insecticide, herbicide, fungicide, and other chemical preventatives. I'm describing what's called in agricultural circles the scale-up problem. The more yield you get, the more chemicals you need. I think this is a very serious risk for developing nations that are desperate to equalize the trade imbalance with agricultural superpowers like the U.S. It can contribute to serious, permanent ecological damage. As I mentioned, I think GMO, or at least selective breeding, can also be the solution to this problem, but it won't come without a radical change in the way we conduct agriculture around the world. Corporatization of food crops. This is, I think, the scariest and most real of the concerns about GMO crops. Corporations are amoral. That is, they do not have a moral system. They simply make the decision that most benefits them. If they don't, their competitor does and beats them. So we shouldn't look to corporations to be self-regulating in a vacuum. We need either an informed moral consumer or an informed moral regulatory agency to intervene, to set limits. That's why I think criticism of crop tech giant Monsanto is a little out of place. Of course, they will do terrible things if it's very profitable for them. But when they're allowed to do these things, I view it as a regulatory failure, not a failure of the technology or the company. Protesting Monsanto, while it's going to make you feel good, probably won't do much to their policies. I think it's better to focus on smarter regulations and consumer education, and ultimately we need to reform the campaign finance system. In my humble opinion, the best thing that could happen would be a worldwide promotion of locally adapted crops and a serious reconsideration of what I see as the greatest sin in global agriculture, monocropping. There's too much wheat, corn, and soy in production in places where it barely grows. Not enough teff, millet, cowpeas, and yam. That's because the market for these commodities are not as strong, but it hurts farmers in areas where the cash crops don't have good yields. Here's my final thought on the matter. I worry that rich white people in the first world tend to focus on the possible effects GMOs will have on them at the cost of death, disease, and poverty in other parts of the world. There's a certain smugness about going to the farmer's market and buying organic, locally grown hobby garden products. It's right to be concerned about possible allergy or fertility or toxic effects in humans or the population of the monarch butterfly, but contrast that with the 16,000 children who die every day of starvation, the 1 billion people who go to bed hungry every day. I don't have all the answers on this issue, but I know whatever solution we follow, it needs to give consideration to butterflies, rich white people, but also the suffering and starvation in the world. We need to find the best and most ethical path, and the only way to do that is from a rational human perspective. Thanks for watching.
So do you know what genetically modified foods are?
Like tomatoes and things they do, like to make them last longer when they ship them and stuff.
Right.
Or bettered or improved by species, by collecting the best of and keep going. But
I've heard of them. Yeah, I don't know how big of a fan I am, but
Right.
Yeah, I don't really know if it's good or bad.
Did you know that we've been eating these foods for the last 10 years?
No, I haven't known that. Where do they normally sell those kind of foods?
I'm kind of taken back by it. I thought it was just grown in soil, and I didn't know they were modifying my food.
I know.
It's kind of scary.
Well, I know it's been a while. I didn't realize quite that long.
Well, the simplest way to put it is that scientists had an idea to make crops more resilient to external factors. So let's say you grow tomatoes, and at night it gets so cold that by morning half your tomatoes are frozen, and now you can't sell them anymore. This is what scientists were able to change through genetic modification. They figured out a way to take DNA from one organism and put it inside a completely different organism to create a desired and specific outcome. For example, let's go back to the tomato scenario. Scientists recognized that Arctic flounder, yes, that's the fish, could withstand extremely cold temperatures. They thought, what if we took the DNA trait that allows the flounder to withstand the cold and put it inside the tomato DNA so that the tomato could withstand the same temperatures? Now you've just narrowed your chances of your tomatoes becoming frozen. This idea that you can now get 100% crop yield was the original guiding principle for genetic modification. Our friends at Lilly Films have a documentary called The Future of Food by Deborah Coons Garcia that explains it best.
Genetic engineering is really a radical revolution in food production. It's really a cell invasion technology. You know, people have heard they're taking a flounder gene and putting it in tomato so the tomato can last in cold temperatures. But people don't ask, how does that flounder gene get in that tomato? How does it get in there? And what really happens is, the only way you can do it is to invade the cell of the tomato and deposit the flounder gene. Well, what's good at invading cells? Bacteria and viruses.
After 12 years of searching, Monsanto found a soil bacteria that is naturally immune to Roundup herbicide. Their goal was to genetically engineer DNA from these bacteria into various plants. They cut out a sequence of DNA that is resistant to Roundup. But if this DNA sequence alone is inserted into a corn plant, it will have no effect. So the next step involves E. coli bacteria. Gaps are created in the E. coli DNA, and when the two test tubes are mixed together, some of the E. coli DNA recombines with the Roundup-resistant bacteria. Then the technicians smuggle the engineered DNA into the cells of the corn plant they want to modify. Cells will naturally reject foreign DNA, so they developed a method using soil bacteria that causes tumors in plants. They use this bacteria to ferry the engineered DNA into the plant's nucleus. There are also 2 other methods used to get the engineered DNA through the cell wall. One uses a stream of electricity to create tiny holes in the plant cells so they become vulnerable to infiltration by foreign DNA. Another is the gene gun, which blasts particles of gold coated with engineered DNA into the plant cells. Each of these 3 methods needs a promoter gene that turns on the desired characteristics. The promoter gene is often extracted from the cauliflower mosaic virus.
This capacity of bacteria and viruses to invade mammals in different ways is what really has a lot of people edgy about biotechnology, because that's really what the tools are all about. In order to move genetic material from one organism to another that don't normally cross, you've got to sort of behave like bacteria and viruses and invade into the cells and become established, just like a virus must become established.
American Heritage Medical Dictionary defines genetically modified organisms as an organism whose genetic characteristics have been altered by the insertion of a modified gene or a gene from another organism using the techniques of genetic engineering. The hope was that this biotechnology would end world hunger by creating higher crop yields. Ironically, we have found studies that indicate just the opposite. Reports have shown that genetically modified crops actually produce fewer yields. In fact, in some countries where starvation rates are very high, there have been many cases of citizens burning genetically modified crops in protest. Like the Future of Food said, Monsanto, the largest biotech company in the world, was able to make seeds that resisted their own Roundup herbicide. This allows farmers to spray as much herbicide as they want without worrying about their crops dying. But it doesn't stop there. Scientists can now make seeds that produce their own pesticide. This is like you and me walking around with a mosquito repellent coming out of our pores. How do they do this? Scientists found a bacteria in the soil that is lethal to many species of insects called Bacillus thuringiensis, or BT for short, and they genetically engineered it into the crops. So what could the effects be when the bacteria that only used to live in our soil is now being distributed into the air through our crops? In the Philippines, the people living next to the genetically engineered cornfield developed recurring skin, respiratory, and intestinal problems. Blood tests were done on 39 of the Filipinos, and it was revealed that their immune system was affected by the BT toxin that the corn had released. And there's still more. Instead of just making drugs in labs, scientists have been growing crops that produce their pharmaceutical drugs, like research chemicals, blood proteins, antibodies, and vaccines, just to name a few. According to the Society of Diabetic Rights, thousands of diabetics have experienced bad reactions, and many have died as a result of this genetically engineered insulin called synthetic or human insulin. The Union of Concerned Scientists have been urging the United States Department of Agriculture to put a ban on pharma crops due to the potential that they could contaminate all of our food supply.